Margaret Cole had lived in the same small house on Maple Street in Springfield, Missouri for nearly 3 decades. The house was simple but well cared for: white siding, a narrow front porch, and a small garden she tended every spring. After her husband died 12 years earlier, the quiet inside those walls became heavier than she ever expected. But the silence was not only because she lived alone. Her only son, Nathan Cole, had been in prison. For 8 years Margaret's life revolved around one hope: that someday Nathan would walk through the front door again, not as the troubled young man who had left in handcuffs, but as someone ready to start over. She never missed a visiting day. No matter how long the drive was, Margaret packed a small bag, filled her car with gas, and made the trip to the state correctional facility. Sometimes Nathan barely spoke during those visits. Sometimes he looked angry, distant, or exhausted. But Margaret always left believing that somewhere inside him, the boy she raised was still there. On the morning of his release, she arrived outside the prison gates nearly an hour early. She stood beside her aging blue sedan, clutching a paper bag with a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a clean jacket she had bought the week before. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling that after so many years, the waiting was finally over. When the gates opened and Nathan stepped out, Margaret recognized him instantly. He looked older than 31. His shoulders were broader, his face harder, and his eyes carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Prison had carved years into him that time alone could not explain. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Margaret walked forward. "Nathan," she said softly. The sound of her voice seemed to break through whatever wall he had built around himself. "Hi, Mom," he replied. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. "I'm so glad you're home," she whispered. Nathan didn't hug her back right away. When he finally did, it was brief and awkward, like someone unsure how to return to a place he once belonged. They drove back towards Springfield in near silence. Margaret tried to talk about the house, about neighbors who had asked about him, about the fresh start waiting for him. Nathan mostly stared out the window, watching the landscape pass by. The road ahead stretched wide and open. To Margaret, it looked like the beginning of a second chance. But inside Nathan, something far more complicated had come home with him. By the time Margaret Cole pulled into the driveway on Maple Street, the afternoon sun was already settling over the quiet neighborhood. The house looked exactly the same as it had the day Nathan left years earlier: white siding, a slightly crooked mailbox, and the small porch where Margaret often sat in the evenings with a cup of tea. Nathan stepped out of the car slowly, studying the place as if he were seeing it for the first time. Margaret watched him carefully. "Still looks the same, doesn't it?" she said gently. Nathan shrugged. "Yeah, pretty much." But inside the house, Margaret had been preparing for weeks. The moment Nathan walked through the door, the faint smell of home-cooked food filled the air. She had spent the entire morning cooking: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the same meal Nathan used to ask for when he was younger. His old bedroom had been cleaned from top to bottom. Fresh sheets covered the bed. The small wooden desk he used in high school was still by the window. Even the faded baseball poster he once refused to take down was still taped to the wall. Margaret had preserved the room as if time had paused. Nathan stood quietly in the doorway, taking it all in. "You didn't have to keep everything," he said. Margaret smiled softly. "I wanted you to feel like you still had a place here." For a moment, Nathan didn't respond. He ran his hand along the back of the chair beside the desk, then looked out the window toward the backyard. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight. At dinner, Margaret talked more than Nathan did. She told him about the neighbors who had asked about him over the years. She mentioned the small grocery store that had closed down and the new church group she joined after his father passed away. Nathan listened quietly, occasionally nodding, but his eyes often drifted toward the window. Margaret noticed the tension in his shoulders, the guarded way he moved. Prison had changed him. Still, she refused to let that thought linger too long. "We'll figure things out," she said gently while clearing the dishes. "One step at a time." Nathan leaned back in his chair. You really think I can just start over like that? Margaret met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, she said. I do. Later that night, when the house finally grew quiet, Margaret stood in the hallway outside Nathan's bedroom door. The light underneath the door was still on. She almost knocked. But instead, she whispered softly to herself. He just needs time. For Margaret, Hope had survived 8 long years. And she believed, with all the faith a mother could carry, that bringing her son home was the beginning of something better. The first few days after Nathan returned to Maple Street passed quietly, but beneath that quiet, something unsettled lingered in the air. Margaret tried to create a sense of normal life. Each morning she woke early, brewed coffee, and set 2 cups on the kitchen table instead of 1. It was a small ritual she had imagined for years while Nathan was gone. When Nathan finally came downstairs that first morning, his movements were slow and cautious, as if the simple freedom of walking through a house without permission still felt unfamiliar. Margaret smiled warmly. I made coffee. Nathan nodded and sat down. For a while they drank in silence, the ticking kitchen clock filling the room. Margaret tried to ease into conversation. We can start looking for work this week, she said gently. There are a few warehouses hiring outside town. Nathan stared into his coffee. Yeah, maybe. The words sounded distant, almost hollow. Later that day, Margaret drove Nathan to fill out his first job application. She waited in the car while he went inside a small distribution center. When he returned 20 minutes later, his expression said everything. They asked about my record, he said as he shut the car door. Margaret kept her voice calm. And? Nathan gave a bitter laugh. They said they'd call. Margaret knew what that meant. They drove home quietly, the road stretching ahead in silence. That night Nathan sat alone on the back porch, smoking cigarettes one after another. The orange glow of each ember flickered in the dark while Margaret watched from the kitchen window. Prison had not only taken years from Nathan's life, it had reshaped the way he saw the world. To him, every conversation felt like judgment. Every rejection felt like proof that the past would never let him go. By the 4th day, the frustration inside him had begun to show. I tried, Mom, Nathan said one evening, tossing his jacket onto the couch. Nobody wants someone like me. Margaret stepped closer, her voice steady. People need time to see who you are now. Nathan shook his head slowly. They already decided who I am. Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his arm. You're still my son. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Something unreadable passed across his face, part pain, part anger, part exhaustion. He pulled away gently. Yeah, he said quietly. But when he walked back outside and lit another cigarette, the weight he carried from the past seemed heavier than anything waiting in the future. By the 6th day, the quiet routine Margaret had tried to build inside the house began to fracture. At first the changes were subtle. Nathan slept later each morning and spent longer hours outside the house. He said he was going out to clear his head, but he rarely explained where he went or who he saw. Margaret didn't push him for answers. She knew too much pressure could push him away. Still, the uneasiness inside her grew. One evening the sun had already set when Margaret heard the front door open. Nathan stepped inside, the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket. His expression was tense, and he avoided eye contact as he walked past her toward the kitchen. You're home late, Margaret said carefully. Nathan opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. I was out. Margaret folded her hands together. I figured that. He took a long drink, then leaned against the counter. You don't have to wait up for me every night, he said. I'm not waiting, she replied softly. I just worry. Nathan exhaled slowly, the frustration in his eyes growing more visible. Mom, I'm not a teenager. I know that. Then stop acting like I need supervision. Margaret paused before answering. I'm not supervising you. I'm trying to help. Nathan's jaw tightened. Help how? By making sure you don't fall back into the same things that got you in trouble before. The words were spoken gently, but the moment they left her mouth, Margaret knew they had landed wrong. Nathan straightened. "So that's what this is," he said. "You think I'm already heading back to prison?" "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant." Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, Nathan. I just want you to have a better life than before." Nathan let out a dry laugh. "A better life," he muttered. "No one out there is giving me one." The room grew quiet. Margaret studied her son's face, the tension around his eyes, the restlessness in the way he moved. The anger inside him wasn't explosive yet, but it was building, like pressure inside a sealed container. "Nathan," she said gently, "we'll figure things out together." But Nathan had already turned toward the door. "I just need some air." He stepped outside, letting the door close harder than he intended. Margaret remained standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty doorway. For days she had tried to believe that peace had returned to their home. But now, the first cracks in that fragile peace were beginning to show. The morning of the 8th day arrived quietly, the same way the previous 7 had. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting long stripes of light across the table where Margaret Cole sat with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Nathan was still asleep upstairs. Margaret had been awake for hours. She hadn't slept well the night before. The tension that had been building between them lingered in her mind, replaying in small fragments of conversation and unfinished thoughts. She told herself things would settle down. Adjusting after prison took time. Everyone said that. Around late morning, she heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Nathan walked into the kitchen wearing an old gray sweatshirt and jeans. His hair was messy, and the tired look in his eyes made him appear older than 31. He opened the refrigerator and stared inside for a moment before shutting it. "You got any cash?" he asked. Margaret looked up. "For what?" Nathan shrugged. "Just need a little money." Margaret hesitated. Money had always been a sensitive subject during Nathan's younger years. Before prison, it often meant trouble, bad friends, bad decisions. "How much?" she asked carefully. $50. Margaret slowly set her coffee cup down. "Nathan, we talked about this. Until you find work, we need to be careful with money." Nathan's shoulders stiffened. "It's just $50. "I know," Margaret said gently. "But I need to know what it's for." Nathan leaned back against the counter. "So now I have to explain every dollar I spend?" "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" Margaret took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I'm trying to help you get back on your feet." Nathan's voice sharpened. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Nathan pushed away from the counter, frustration rising quickly. "You don't trust me," he said. Margaret shook her head. "That's not it at all." "Then why say no?" The question hung heavily in the air. Margaret stood slowly from the table. "Nathan, I just want to make sure things go differently this time." But the phrase "this time" landed like a spark on dry ground. Nathan's expression changed instantly. "Oh, I get it," he said, his voice tightening. "You still think I'm the same screw-up who got locked up." "That's not what I meant." "Yeah, it is." Margaret stepped closer, trying to keep her voice calm. "I believe you can rebuild your life." Nathan laughed bitterly. "Rebuild what?" "No one out there wants anything to do with me." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Nathan continued, the anger that had been simmering for days finally breaking through. 8 years, Mom," he said. 8 years of my life gone." Margaret's voice softened. "I know that." Nathan shook his head slowly. "No, you don't." The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed along Maple Street, the sound fading into the distance. Inside the small kitchen, the tension between mother and son had reached a point where neither of them knew how to step back. And the day that had begun so quietly was about to change everything. The silence in the kitchen stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Margaret could see the anger in Nathan's face now, no longer hidden beneath frustration, but fully present. Nathan paced across the small kitchen floor, his hands moving restlessly through his hair. "You think you understand what those 8 years were like?" he said sharply. Margaret kept her voice steady. "No. I don't. But I know it must have been hard." Nathan stopped walking. "Hard," he repeated bitterly. "You have no idea." Margaret stepped closer, her expression soft but serious. "I spent 8 years waiting for you to come home." Nathan laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah. Waiting in this house while I was locked inside a cage." Margaret felt the sting in his words but refused to respond with anger. "I never stopped believing you could change," she said. Nathan's eyes flashed. "Change," he said. "You think prison fixes people?" Margaret hesitated, then answered honestly. "I hoped it might give you a chance to start again." Nathan turned away, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" Margaret's voice softened even more. "Nathan, listen to me. I just want us to move forward." But Nathan suddenly turned back toward her, his voice rising. "You want to move forward? After what you did?" Margaret froze. "What are you talking about?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "You stood in that courtroom and told them everything." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "I told the truth." Nathan stepped closer. "You told them I was out of control, that I was using drugs, that I needed help." Tears formed in Margaret's eyes. "I said those things because they were true. And because I hoped it would save you." Nathan shook his head. "No. You helped put me there." Margaret's voice trembled, but she did not step away. "Nathan. I tried to protect you." For a moment neither of them spoke. The anger that had been building inside Nathan for years suddenly surged forward. And in that small living room, in a moment that lasted only seconds, the fragile hope Margaret had carried for 8 years collapsed into something neither of them could undo. The house that had once felt like a place of forgiveness had become the setting for a tragedy no one could stop. The quiet neighborhood on Maple Street had always been the kind of place where evenings passed peacefully. Porch lights glowed softly, neighbors walked their dogs, and the sound of distant televisions drifted through open windows. But that calm was broken shortly after sunset. A 911 call brought police officers rushing toward the small white house where Margaret Cole had lived for nearly 30 years. When the first patrol car arrived, the street was unusually still. No crowds had gathered yet. No one stood outside watching. Only the flashing red and blue lights reflected against the quiet homes along the block. Officer Daniel Ruiz approached the front porch carefully. The front door was partially open. Inside, the living room lights were on. Ruiz stepped into the house and immediately saw the scene before him. Margaret Cole lay motionless on the floor of the living room, her body still and silent in the center of the room that had once held family photos, holiday decorations, and years of quiet memories. The house itself showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. Furniture was slightly out of place, evidence of a sudden confrontation rather than a prolonged struggle. Outside, sitting on the front porch steps, was Nathan Cole. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the ground as the police cruiser lights flickered across his face. Officer Ruiz stepped outside and spoke calmly. "Nathan Cole?" Nathan looked up slowly. "Yes. We need you to stand up." Nathan obeyed without resistance. As the officer guided him toward the patrol car, Nathan's expression remained distant, almost numb. Another officer asked the question everyone needed answered. "What happened in there tonight?" Nathan didn't look back toward the house. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "I lost control." Within minutes, the quiet street filled with more patrol cars, investigators, and crime scene technicians. Yellow tape stretched across the front yard as neighbors began to gather at a distance, whispering to one another in disbelief. Many of them had known Margaret for years. She was the woman who waved from her porch, who brought homemade cookies to neighborhood gatherings, who spoke proudly about her son finally coming home. Now the house where she had waited 8 long years for Nathan's return had become a crime scene. And the tragedy that unfolded inside those walls would leave the entire community struggling to understand how hope had turned into heartbreak in just 8 days. As the flashing lights continued to wash over Maple Street, detectives began piecing together the final hours of Margaret Cole's life. The house was quiet again, but now every room carried the weight of what had happened. Lead investigator Detective Marcus Hale arrived shortly after the patrol officers secured the scene. Hale had spent nearly 20 years working homicide cases across Greene County. He had learned that the hardest cases were rarely the most complicated ones. Often, the most painful truths were the simplest. He stepped slowly through the living room, studying the surroundings with careful attention. Family photographs lined the shelves, Nathan as a child holding a baseball glove, Margaret smiling beside him during a school ceremony, a faded picture of the Cole family taken years before tragedy entered their lives. Nothing inside the house suggested a break-in. No shattered windows. No forced doors. Just a home interrupted by a sudden eruption of anger. Outside, neighbors had begun gathering behind the yellow tape. Several of them spoke with officers, their voices low with disbelief. One woman who lived across the street shook her head. "Margaret loved that boy," she said quietly. "She waited years for him to come back." Detective Hale listened as patrol officers described what they had seen when they arrived. Nathan Cole had been sitting calmly on the porch, offering no resistance when he was taken into custody. Later that evening, Nathan sat inside a small interrogation room at the Springfield Police Department. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them as Detective Hale took a seat across the table. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Hale folded his hands. "You were out of prison 8 days, he said evenly. "Tell me what happened today." Nathan rubbed his hands together, staring down at the metal table. "We started arguing," he said quietly. "About what?" "Money, work, everything." Hale watched him carefully. "And then?" Nathan swallowed hard. "I got angry." The detective remained silent, allowing the words to settle. Nathan finally looked up, his eyes tired and distant. "I didn't plan it," he said. Detective Hale had heard those words many times before. But this case carried a deeper tragedy. Because sometimes the most devastating crimes were not driven by strangers or elaborate motives, only by years of unresolved pain finally breaking through in a single moment no one could take back. The trial of Nathan Cole began nearly a year after the tragedy on Maple Street. By then, the small community in Springfield had already carried the weight of the story for months. Many of the people filling the courtroom benches that morning had known Margaret Cole personally. Some had gone to church with her. Others had lived beside her for decades. They had watched her wait for her son's return. Now they had come to witness what justice would look like after that hope ended in tragedy. Nathan sat quietly at the defense table, wearing a dark suit that looked slightly too large for him. His expression remained distant as the courtroom slowly filled. He rarely looked toward the gallery, where several neighbors sat with solemn faces. At the front of the courtroom, Prosecutor Evelyn Carter rose to address the jury. "Margaret Cole spent 8 years believing her son deserved another chance," Carter said calmly. "She welcomed him home with open arms. 8 days later, she was dead." The room remained silent as her words settled over the jury. The prosecution laid out a clear timeline. Nathan had returned home after prison. Tension built inside the house over several days. On the 8th day, a heated argument erupted over money, work, and the past that neither mother nor son could escape. Detective Marcus Hale later testified about Nathan's confession during the interrogation. He admitted the argument escalated, Hale told the court. He said he lost control. When it was the defense attorney's turn, the focus shifted to Nathan's mental state after years of incarceration. "Prison changes people," the defense argued. Mr. Cole returned to a world that no longer had a place for him. He struggled with anger, rejection, and the overwhelming pressure of rebuilding his life. but the central fact of the case remained unchanged. Margaret Cole had died inside the home where she had spent years preparing for her son's return. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom felt heavy with emotion. Not because the facts were confusing, but because everyone present understood the painful truth behind them. This was not a mystery. It was a family tragedy, one that had begun with hope and ended with irreversible loss. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Nathan Cole stood motionless as the judge spoke the final words of the sentence. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but for many in the room, it felt less like justice and more like the closing of a painful chapter no one had wanted to witness. Nathan listened without expression as the years of his sentence were announced. He had already spent much of his adult life behind prison walls, yet the weight of this conviction felt different. The first time he had gone to prison, he blamed everyone else, his friends, the system, the circumstances that led him there. This time, the truth was impossible to escape. The person he had hurt most was gone forever. Across the courtroom, several of Margaret Cole's neighbors quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Many of them remembered the woman who had lived on Maple Street for so long, the one who always greeted people with a warm smile and asked about their families. Margaret had believed deeply in forgiveness. Even after her son was convicted years earlier, she never stopped defending him when others spoke harshly about his mistakes. "He's still my boy," she had once told a neighbor during a church gathering. That belief never changed. Detective Marcus Hale later reflected on the case during a quiet conversation with a reporter. "Some crimes take months of planning," Hale said. "Others happen in moments when anger takes over and no one steps back in time." The small white house on Maple Street eventually stood empty. The garden Margaret once cared for slowly faded, and the porch where she used to sit during warm evenings remained silent. For the community, the story became something difficult to forget. A mother had waited 8 years for her son to come home. She welcomed him with hope, patience, and the belief that people could change. But in the end, it took only 8 days to destroy everything she had waited for. And the cost of those 8 days would follow Nathan Cole for the rest of his life.